The 7,180th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Albania, Andorra, Austria, Belgium, Botswana, Bulgaria, Canada, the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Libya, Liechtenstein, Malta, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Panama, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Republic of Moldova, Romania, Samoa, San Marino, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Serbia, Seychelles, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, the Syrian Arab Republic, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Turkey, Ukraine, and the United Arab Emirates to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2014/348, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Botswana, Bulgaria, Canada, Central African Republic, Chile, Cote d'Ivoire, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Latvia, Libya, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Panama, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, the Republic of Moldova, Romania, Samoa, San Marino, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Serbia, Seychelles, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America. I wish to welcome the Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Jan Eliasson, and I now give him the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Secretary General. Since the outbreak of the war in Syria, I have persistently called for accountability for perpetrators of grave human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The recent attacks against humanitarian convoys and personnel, which may constitute war crimes, add to the urgent need to see action now on accountability in Syria. The Security Council has an inescapable responsibility in this regard. States that are members of both the Security Council and the Human Rights Council have a particular duty to end the bloodshed and to ensure justice for the victims of unspeakable crimes. In February 2013, the Commission of Inquiry concluded that the International Criminal Court is the appropriate venue to pursue the fight against impunity in Syria. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has repeatedly called on the Council to refer the situation in Syria to the court, most recently this April. The Syrian people have a fundamental right to justice. The United Nations and its member states have a fundamental duty to defend that right. I support mechanisms that can genuinely hold perpetrators to account. It is clear in this case that no side in this tragedy is innocent. Let us also recall that accountability will help prevent further atrocities. For more than 3 years, this Council has been unable to agree on measures that could bring an end to this extraordinarily brutal war. It has deeply affected and damaged not only millions of Syrian civilians, but also the entire region. If members of the Council continue to be unable to agree on a measure that could provide some accountability for the ongoing crimes, the credibility of this body and of the entire organization will continue to suffer. When we talk of accountability, we should be thinking not only of the parties to the conflict. We should also think of those outside who are fueling the conflict and exacerbating the suffering by their continued supply of weapons to those who are committing the atrocities. I call again on the Council and plead with the members to set aside their differences and to work together on a joint approach that can bring an end to this long nightmare for the Syrian people. They desperately need an end to the violence and a political solution. We all have a responsibility to help the Syrian people finally see a future of peace. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Eliasson for his statement. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I asked to take the floor before voting began on the draft resolution which France had the honor of presenting in order to explain the reason for our action. Indeed, France's proposal is not a new installment of the divisions which affect our Council in the Syrian crisis. To the contrary, it seeks to find unity of the Council around the shared values of its members. Mr. President, everybody around this table is horrified by the tragedy which the Syrian people is going through. Over 160,000 dead, over 9 million displaced people and refugees, a country which has been destroyed, hunger, epidemics. This already would be a crushing burden. But we add to this the certainty that atrocities have been committed by both parties against a hapless civilian population. The presentation to this Council and to the press of the Caesar report on France's initiative highlighted the barbarity just a few weeks ago. Thousands of photographs, authenticated by independent experts, showed the bodies of the dead who had been tortured and starved by the regime. There are killings, there is torture, there is rape today in Syria, not only as a dire consequence of a civil war, but also in the framework of a deliberate policy to terrorize and to punish. Leaders give free rein to their troops to forget law or even humanity. The government bombs civilian neighborhoods with barrel bombs, with missiles, and with chemical weapons. Terrorist groups attack blindly. People are being disappeared in the tens of thousands. There's torture on a wide scale, and people are being starved. We are watching, in a country with an ancient civilization, the unleashing of brutality and cruelty, where victims are not just statistics behind which we hide too often, but men, women, children with name, with faces, and with loved ones. Mr. President, in the face of all of this slippery slope, in the face of this denial of values represented by this organization, nothing is worse than silence, because silence is acquiescence, it is consent, it is complicity. I do not ignore the divisions of this Council. I am aware of the divergent analyses of one side and another. I respect them even if I do not share them. But certain facts are clear to all. As Mr. Brahimi told the Council a few days ago, there is no prospect of negotiation in Syria today. The time has not come to assign responsibility to a party, but simply to note it, arguing that the intervention of international justice would harm a peace process does not make sense, because there is no peace process. In the short and medium term, there is no prospect of a peace process. There is no negotiation going on because there is a will to conquer, and there is a belief that the war can be won. Negotiations will not take place because it is an issue of killing or being killed. Negotiations will not take place with those whose brothers and wives have been killed and tortured. They are too afraid of their vengeance. They will have to be killed in turn. In this context, France's proposal is based on the conviction that this impasse should not lead us to close our eyes to the atrocities committed every day in Syria. We intend to go beyond our disagreement to address ourselves to the part of humanity that we all share. The draft resolution is acceptable for all. It implements a principle already agreed upon on Syria in resolutions 2118 and 2139, that of the refusal to let things go unpunished. It covers all of Syrian territory. When it comes to the responsibility of the parties, it returns to language agreed upon many times, and it contents itself with calling for the recognition of the jurisdiction of the ICC in the Syrian civil war, according to the two terms close to resolutions 1593 in Darfur and 1970 on Libya, against which no member state voted. This United Council will thus say that it will not forget the crimes that are being massively committed today in Syria. It will not forget that leaders tolerated them or even encouraged or ordered them. It will thus say that in 2014, people can no longer behave as they did in 1942 and 1994. And it will not be possible for the state of barbarity to return as it did in 1942. Perhaps we can stop an evildoer on the verge of committing a crime, but in any case, we will return this Council its honor by allowing it to say the right thing, by reestablishing the morals that go beyond its divisions, because beyond this we share the same values, the same indignation and the same determination. The time has come to say so. The time has come to prove it. The draft I have the honor to presenting to my colleagues for vote is an appeal to human conscience. It is not a political gesture. It is a moral act, quite simply. And if the Council were not to adopt it, it would be an insult to the millions of Syrians who are suffering. It would be proof that some have learned nothing from history. It would recall that some chose, even though they claim otherwise, that to unconditionally support the Damascus regime, whatever the crimes it commits, and even exonerating it on the same footing and at the same time as Al-Qaeda, covering all criminals with the same impunity is not a paradox. There is a brotherhood in crime. A veto today would recall this. A veto would cover up all crimes. It would be vetoing justice. It would be giving new justification to the French proposal to limit the use of the right of veto in the case of mass atrocities. I thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of France for his statements. I shall now put the draft resolution to the vote. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2014/348 please raise their hands? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 2 votes against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of permanent members of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor first to the representative of the United States.
Thank you. Today is about accountability for crimes so extensive, so deadly, that they have few equals in modern history. Today is about accountability for Syria. But it is also about accountability for this Security Council. It is this Council's responsibility to stop atrocities, if we can, and at a minimum, to ensure that the perpetrators of atrocities are held accountable. It was toward that minimum that we sought to make progress today. My government applauds the vast majority of members of this Council who voted to support, and the some 64 countries who joined us in co-sponsoring this effort to refer these atrocities to the International Criminal Court. Sadly, because of the decision by the Russian Federation to back the Syrian regime no matter what it does, the Syrian people will not see justice today. They will see crime, but not punishment. On April 15th, the members of this Council were briefed on a report that included 55,000 gruesome photos of the emaciated and tortured bodies of dead Syrians who world-renowned international lawyers concluded had been methodically eliminated by a government killing machine. The pictures were reportedly provided by an individual, alias Caesar, who worked for 13 years as part of the Syrian military police. When the fighting began, he says that he was instructed to record the images of people starved, beaten, tortured, and executed by Syria's security forces. These photos shock and horrify, even after some of us wondered if there was anything the regime could do that would still shock. Syrian soldiers already had compelled doctors not to care for the wounded, dragged patients out of hospital beds, laid siege to whole neighborhoods, cut off access to desperately needed supplies, and carried out chemical weapons attacks and barrel bomb attacks with the full confidence that meaningful action by this Council would be obstructed. A judicial process does more than hold perpetrators accountable. It also allows victims to speak. The vetoes today have prevented the victims of atrocities from testifying at The Hague for now. But nonetheless, it is important for us here today to hear the kind of testimony we might have heard if Russia and China had not raised their hands to oppose accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Because of the vetoes just cast, one of Assad's victims, Qusay Zakaria, will not soon be called to testify before the International Criminal Court. But Qusay's story of life in Muadamiyah during the siege, as hard as it is to hear, must be heard. Qusay Zakaria is here with us today, and I'd like to ask him to stand. Today I will tell Qusay's story as he told it to us. Qusay's home, Muadamiyah, just outside of Damascus, was one of the Assad regime's prime targets. During the August 2013 chemical weapons attacks, Qusay ran out to the street and tried to help his neighbors. He quickly lost his ability to breathe. His eyes afire, Qusay's heart stopped, and he was left for dead before a friend stumbled upon him and realized he had again begun breathing. Qusay recounts his bewilderment as he watched neighbors suffocate, friends panic, and families perish. He remembers the face of a 13-year-old boy just a few feet from his home. He describes the boy as so innocent. He recalls he had done nothing. Yet the expression on this 13-year-old's face was the most terrifying thing Qusay has ever seen, as white foam streamed from his mouth and death crept in. If Qusay could testify, he might tell the story of his neighbor, Abu Muhammad, a waiter in Damascus, while his wife and daughter lived in Muadamiyah. Abu Muhammad's daughter was 7 years old. She had a heart condition that required medication not available in besieged Muadamiyah. So Abu Muhammad did what any father would do and attempted to bring her medicine from Damascus. He was captured by Assad's mercenaries, tortured with acid, and ultimately killed. His body was thrown on Highway 40. And without medicine to treat her heart condition, Abu Muhammad's 7-year-old daughter died. Qusay might also tell the story of Rana, an 18-month-old baby girl. Rana's dad ran a grocery store before the siege. After the siege, he watched as his daughter Rana died from malnutrition because she couldn't get milk that used to sit on his store's shelves. Qusay has said that when he walks around the United States, he notices people in restaurants getting on with day-to-day life. He notices the small leftovers that we leave on our plates, and he remembers watching his neighbors' desperation to get a small piece of rotten bread in Muadamiyah. Qusay's account of his experience in Muadamiyah deserves to be heard. It deserves to be examined by an independent court, and if crimes are proven, those responsible deserve to be held accountable. The vetoes cast today prevent that from happening. Strikingly, the vetoes cast today also protect monstrous terrorist organizations operating in Syria. Those who would behead civilians and attack religious minorities will not soon be held accountable at the ICC either. For Russia and China's vetoes today protect not only Assad and his henchmen, but also the radical Islamic terrorists who are pursuing a fundamentalist assault on the Syrian people that knows no decency or humanity. These vetoes have aided impunity not just for Assad, but for terrorist groups as well. In the past, when extraordinary crimes have been carried out, the International Criminal Court has been able to act. Why is it that the people of Uganda, Darfur, Libya, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Kenya deserve international impartial justice, but the Syrian people do not? Why should the International Criminal Court pursue accountability for atrocities in Africa, but none in Syria, where the worst horrors of our time are being perpetrated? For those who have asked the Security Council this very reasonable question, today you have your answer: the Russian and Chinese vetoes. Our grandchildren will ask us years from now how we could have failed to bring justice to people living in hell on earth. The history books may well depict photos taken by Caesar of emaciated, acid-scarred corpses juxtaposed next to a photo of the two members of this council who prevented justice for victims like Qusay, who long to see the end of such horrors. Today is therefore about accountability, not just for the victims of Assad's regime, not just for Qusay and his neighbors in Muadamiyah, but for the members of this Security Council. Month after month and year after year, we have each spoken about the importance of justice and the need for accountability in Syria. Victims and survivors have begged for action and cried for justice. The international community has supported ad hoc efforts to collect evidence, to record testimony. We've launched commissions of inquiry to find facts, and we've held meeting after meeting. But we have not before today brought forward a resolution to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. We have not done so because we were afraid that it would be vetoed. But the victims of the Assad regime's industrial killing machine and the victims of terrorist attacks deserve more than to have more dead counted. They deserve to have each of us, the members of this Security Council, counted and held to account. They deserve to have history record those who stood with them and those who were willing to raise their hands to deny them a chance at justice. While there may be no ICC accountability today for the horrific crimes being carried out against the Syrian people, there should be accountability for those members of this council that have prevented accountability. Now, the representatives from Syria and perhaps Russia may suggest that the resolution voted on today was biased, and I agree. It was biased in the direction of establishing facts, tilted as well in the direction of peace. The peace that comes from holding individuals, not whole groups, not Alawites, not Sunni, not Kurds, but individuals accountable. The outcome of today's vote, disappointing as it is, will not end our pursuit of justice. My government will continue to work with so many other governments and organizations to encourage and facilitate the further gathering of evidence. There is no limit to our determination to see that the victims of atrocities in Syria and their loved ones receive answers in accordance with the majesty of law. In this quest, we will be guided by a fundamental principle of civilization, a principle that has truly stood the test of time. And I quote, "Those who are not wronged, no less than those who are wronged, must exert themselves to punish the wrongdoers," end quote. So said Solon, the Athenian sage, more than 2,500 years ago, and so affirmed the overwhelming majority of this council today. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Rwanda.
Thank you. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its vote on this draft resolution A/2014/348, requesting the referral of the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic to the International Criminal Court, ICC. I thank Mr. Jan Eliasson, Deputy Secretary General, for his statement, and I acknowledge the presence amongst us of Ambassador Bashar Jafari, Permanent Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to the United Nations. Mr. President, the position of Rwanda on the ICC is well known, as we have expressed it on several occasions in this Council. The debate on the ICC is indeed legitimate and should continue within the United Nations with a view to achieving altogether a fair and more efficient international criminal justice, able to better fight against impunity for the most serious crimes. However, Mr. President, we are not here today to hold another substantive debate on the ICC. As well stated by the Ambassador of the United States, Samantha Power, and I totally agree with her. Our grandchildren will ask us one day, what have you done to stop this Syrian tragedy? We are here as fathers, as mothers, as human beings, representatives of the community of nations, who should listen to the voices of more than 160,000 souls slain for the past 3 years in Syria, reminding us that this cancer cannot be inured to mass atrocities. We are here, Mr. President, as a collective body vested with the responsibility to maintain international peace and security, which includes the responsibility to protect and the obligation to hold accountable perpetrators of the most serious crimes. Children were gazed to death. Women were sexually abused. Men were tortured. Barrel bombs were used against hospitals and schools. Communities devastated by terrorist attacks, and Syria is living in an endless horror. Mr. President, Rwanda has repeatedly called for a political solution to the Syrian crisis within the framework of the Geneva peace process. We have also endorsed the call of the Secretary General, who urged all concerned UN member states to refrain from supplying weapons to either side in Syria, and we regret that none of the concerned states has heeded to this call. Nonetheless, the magnitude of human rights violations in Syria required an immediate action by the international community, mainly by the Security Council. And we all know that the Syrian jurisdictions are currently not in a position to hold perpetrators of mass atrocities in Syria to account. We therefore thank France for introducing this draft resolution as a strong signal to the warring parties in Syria that the Security Council is committed to accountability. This is why Rwanda has voted in favor of this draft resolution. Despite the failed adoption, which we regret, Rwanda does not lose hope for justice and accountability in Syria. But to reach this goal, we need that permanent members of the Security Council open their minds and hearts to find a solution to the humanitarian and human rights disaster. Indeed, despite real achievements in the elimination of the Syrian chemical program, it is clear that the credibility of the Security Council in the maintenance of international peace and security remains seriously challenged over its inability to end the horrors committed in Syria. As co-chair of the group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect, and given our own history of genocide, Rwanda takes this opportunity to reiterate its call to all permanent members of the Security Council to consider seriously and carefully the French proposal of a code of conduct among themselves, by which they will voluntarily refrain from using the veto in situations of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In this context, and pending a meaningful reform of the Security Council, we believe that such code of conduct could be a necessary tool to enable this Council to re-embrace the moral values enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. To conclude, Mr. President, let's all of us commit ourselves to put action for humanity above inaction for interest. This is the only way we can honor the Syrian victims, and the only way we can show to a skeptical world that we, members of the Security Council, have learned lessons from the past and have decided to live up to the noble mission that the community of nations has entrusted in us. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Rwanda for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have heard time and again in this chamber the horrific scale of violations and abuses carried out against civilians by the Syrian regime over the past 3 years of the conflict. The indiscriminate bombardment of civilian inhabited areas, horrendous violations including systematic murder and torture in regime detention centers, the arbitrary denial of humanitarian access to those in need, and the use of siege and starvation as a weapon of war. This resolution offered Syrians the prospect of an end to impunity for the individuals who have committed these atrocities. Holding perpetrators to account for their actions is a vital element of a sustainable peace. No settlement in Syria can be real or lasting without justice. This resolution would have given the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court a mandate to investigate all war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated during the conflict, regardless of the identity or affiliation of the perpetrator. This resolution had the support of 13 members of the Security Council, 65 co-sponsors, and over 100 NGOs from all around the world, as well as the Syrian National Coalition. This shows the strength of international feeling on this issue. It is to Russia and China's shame that they have chosen to block efforts to achieve justice for the Syrian people. And it is disgraceful that they have yet again vetoed the Security Council's efforts to take action in response to the appalling human rights violations being committed every day in Syria. Russia and China will have to justify their behavior not only to these states and organizations, but to so many of the Syrian people who continue to suffer under Assad's brutal regime. Mr. President, the United Kingdom is committed to accountability. Despite today's vote, we will continue to look for ways to ensure that there can be accountability in Syria. We will continue to support efforts to document atrocities ready for the time when those responsible can be held to account. The perpetrators of appalling crimes in Syria may be able to hide behind Russian and Chinese vetoes for now, but they will not be able to evade justice forever. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jordan today voted for the draft resolution proceeding from our deep conviction of the principles of criminal justice and the need for criminal accountability, and in an attempt to put an end to the policy of impunity pursued since the beginning of the Syrian crisis, believing as well in the principles of the Rome Statute of ICC. In this connection, we would like to express our regret, our deep regret, that the Council was unable to adopt that draft today. We wish at the same time to emphasize our support and backing for the French initiative designed to limit the use of veto while the Security Council is voting on draft resolutions relating to the perpetration of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity to avoid the repetition of what we have witnessed today. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Jordan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Mr.
President, for more than 3 years, Syria has been falling further and further into the horror of blind violence, which kills in total impunity. This total impunity is one of the reasons that the parties to the conflict in Syria continue to unleash a bloodbath where civilians are the primary victims. The proof of atrocities committed in Syria are piling up over the course of reports, be it from the International Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, the reports of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Caesar report on systematic torture committed on a broad scale in Syrian prisons, or the NGO reports, in particular on the use of barrel bombs against civilians. Syria is in a state of war, but not all is fair in war. Even war has rules under international law, and these rules are violated every day in Syria. More than 160,000 people have already lost their life in the Syrian conflict. The list of atrocities perpetrated in Syria is too long to state them here, but I would just like to highlight the untold suffering inflicted upon children in the conflict. More than 10,000 children killed, numerous wounded or maimed by airstrikes in residential areas, with the indiscriminate use of cluster bombs and barrel bombs by the Syrian government forces. Children are arrested and recruited as combatants, arbitrarily detained, poorly treated and tortured. Many of them were victims of sexual violence or disappeared. All parties to the conflict have targeted schools and hospitals or used them for military means. To put an end to the conflict and the atrocities in Syria, there's a need to find a political solution, and we all know this. But efforts for a political solution have reached a deadlock, principally due to the Syrian authorities' refusal to discuss a true political transition. For our part, it is unacceptable for this political stalemate to be used by some partners as a pretext to take measures, rather to obstacle measures being taken to combat impunity in Syria. Combating impunity is not at cross purposes with seeking a political solution. To the contrary, combating impunity, it means combating exactly what stokes war and violence. Combating impunity is deterring the perpetrators of crimes from committing them in the future. We remain deeply convinced that justice is a key ingredient, a necessary one, to bring peace back to Syria. This is the reason, since January 2013, with 57 other states, Luxembourg has untiringly advocated for the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court since March 2011, without distinction of the alleged perpetrators of crimes. Syrian victims deserve at least that, a sliver of hope that justice will be served, that the perpetrators of heinous crimes in Syria will be held accountable for their actions. The ICC was created, indeed, to put an end to the impunity for perpetrators of the most serious crimes impacting the international community, and to guarantee the halting of said crimes when a state doesn't have the will or is incapable of doing so. This is indeed the case in Syria. For this reason, Luxembourg was a co-sponsor and voted in favor of France's draft resolution for the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria since March 2011 to the prosecutor of the ICC. More than what we're divided by, there is a core of common values, shared humanity, and shared faith in the dignity and value of the human person, which should bring us together and bring about unanimity in the Security Council. The draft resolution circulated by France reflected these shared values. Without polarizing, it sought to refer the violations committed by all parties to the conflict to the ICC, that is, widespread violations of human rights and international humanitarian law perpetrated by the Syrian government and pro-government militia, on the one hand, as well as violations of human rights and international humanitarian law perpetrated by non-state armed groups, on the other hand. It is with deep regret that today we observe that our shared humanity, shared values did not prevail today, and the resolution was not adopted, given the veto of two permanent members, Russia and China. This double veto is unfortunate for two reasons. It seriously impacts the future of the Syrian people, daily experiencing a spiral of violence without end. It also affects the credibility and effectiveness of the Security Council, making it inactive in the face of impunity. Today, the vote lays bare the deadlock of the Security Council, given an improper use of the right of veto. Here, Luxembourg supports France's proposal, namely that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council would abstain from using the veto in situations dealing with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This voluntary code of conduct would strengthen the credibility of the Council and, first and foremost, its effectiveness in protecting civilians. In spite of today's vote, we shall not give up. In the face of war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in Syria, we will continue to call for justice for the Syrian people and will not lose the hope that our shared humanity will, in the end, prevail. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Luxembourg for her statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We deeply deplore the fact that the draft resolution we have just voted on, which sought to refer the situation of Syria to the International Criminal Court for investigation and punishment of those responsible, whoever they may be, was not adopted. Chile has added its voice on many opportunities to calls for those countries who have the right to veto to refrain from using it in situations of crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, or ethnic cleansing. We believe that the Security Council must be able to act in defense of the most fundamental values and principles of humanity. Chile co-sponsored the draft resolution with an open mind and with the conviction that the draft was a necessary step to bring justice to all victims of the conflict in Syria, making no distinction between the various parties. Mr. President, Chile is a party to the Rome Statute, and as such, we believe that the integrity of the statute must be preserved in order to ensure its full application and effectiveness in the fight against impunity. The International Criminal Court has shown itself to be the best instrument to investigate the facts which led to the draft resolution that was not approved today. Thank you very much, sir.
I thank the representative of Chile for his statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Mr. President, the Security Council has today again failed the people of Syria. The war in Syria is now in its 4th year. The country has been broken apart, possibly irretrievably. Almost half its population of more than 20 million people have fled or been displaced. One family flees Syria every 60 seconds. We face a regime whose military strategy is based on the deliberate targeting of civilians through sieges, the use of starvation as a weapon of war, indiscriminate aerial bombardment, the targeted use of barrel bombs on residential neighbourhoods, the arbitrary denial of humanitarian access and of medical supplies, the targeting of hospitals and medical personnel, mass systematic torture, sexual violence and execution, the forced depopulation of towns and cities, the denial of humanitarian supplies to its own citizens not living in government-held areas. The humanitarian crisis, the greatest this century, is spiralling downwards. There is no solution in sight. All sides in the conflict, including the extremists and terrorists who have sought to hijack the opposition, are guilty of terrible crimes. There is a pervasive culture of impunity. No one is held accountable. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry for Syria has documented extensive evidence over the past 3 years against those who have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has concluded that such crimes have been committed and has consistently, over the past 3 years, called for referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. The Council itself was shown in April the chilling photographic evidence contained in the Caesar report documenting widespread and systematic torture and execution on an industrial scale of detainees held by the Syrian regime. The UN Secretary-General has persistently called for accountability for the crimes we're seeing in Syria. The International Criminal Court was specifically created to ensure that those most responsible for the worst mass atrocity crimes would be held to account, in particular where their national authorities are unwilling or unable to pursue domestic accountability. The Syrian authorities are not only failing in this responsibility, but are themselves among the perpetrators of such crimes. The international community, therefore, has to act. Australia was one of 58 UN member states who wrote to the Council 18 months ago seeking referral of the situation in Syria to the ICC, and the situation is so much worse since then. The number of co-sponsors of this resolution, 65, and the 13 votes in favour should send an unmistakable message to those responsible for these crimes. The resolution may have been vetoed, but there is no statute of limitation on the crimes being committed in Syria, and we will continue to pursue justice for the victims. This Council has a responsibility to protect, a responsibility mandated by all our leaders at their World Summit in 2005, and to prevent mass atrocities where we can. The Council's role was specifically recognised in the Rome Statute because accountability is central to protection and to the Council's fundamental responsibilities on the maintenance of international peace and security. The use of the veto to block a balanced resolution attempting to deliver accountability for the commission of mass atrocity crimes comes at a great human cost. The Council will, correctly, be judged harshly for this failure. At the very least, today's failure underlines the importance of voluntary restraint on the use of the veto in situations where mass atrocities are so clear. Mr. President, this is the fourth veto in the Council in 3 years, preventing action in Syria. In implementing our mandate on peace and security, the Council is now engaged in authorising some of the highest numbers of peacekeepers ever, and increasingly in robust operations to protect civilians in so many crises. We are doing this by common agreement among all members, as we should. But when we fail, as we have again on Syria today, the consequences can be devastating. The victims of conflict have a right to the support of the Security Council and action by us. The Council has a responsibility to provide that support and to act. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia for his statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we all knew what the outcome of this vote would be. And yet it is profoundly disappointing and disturbing to see a fourth veto on a situation in Syria, this time on the referral of Syria conflict to the ICC. We thank France for drafting this resolution, which was sponsored by 65 states, including my own. With more than 160,000 lives lost, 2.7 million refugees, and close to 7 million displacements, this veto is what it is, an endorsement of impunity. It is a license to all the perpetrators of human rights violations, mass atrocities, crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria and elsewhere, that they can continue their grisly acts at will. Gross violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law continue in Syria on a daily basis. Barbaric crimes are being committed on a massive scale, crimes that should have no place in the 21st century. Terrorism is on the rise. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Humanitarian access is denied. Humanitarian aid manipulated to force surrender. The level of physical destruction and devastation is beyond description. A generation of Syria's children, 5.7 million according to UNICEF, are growing up robbed of a childhood, education, home, and consequently of their future. A huge lost generation. Last month, during ARIA formula meeting, many of us were shocked into silence by the images contained in the Caesar report of thousands of emaciated bodies bearing multiple signs of horrific torture. To us, shocking as they were, these were just images. To countless victims in Syria, these are the gruesome facts of their daily lives. More recently, many of us witnessed another testimony to the atrocities committed by the Syrian regime, resulting from the indiscriminate use of barrel bombs. Again, images too shocking to bear, gruesome facts of daily lives to the people of Syria. And yet none of this seems to move those who once again chose to veto a council resolution in Syria, who by doing so chose to protect the victimizers, not the victims, opening ever wider floodgates of bloodshed and impunity. The Syrian regime had ample opportunities to first prevent and then stop the bloodshed. It never sought to do so. A referral to the ICC could not have impeded any process towards peace and reconciliation because no such process was taking place. All sides think they can win the battle by force, which means even more civilian deaths, even more destruction. The long-suffering people of Syria deserve better. As a permanent international court with a mandate to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity, when national authorities are unable or unwilling to do so, the ICC was created to address exactly the type of situation that exists in Syria today. Though the court's work can only be one piece of the larger justice and accountability effort needed in this war-ravaged country, Syria's referral could have been a crucial first step in the right direction. By today's veto, that first crucial step towards justice and accountability was callously denied. Today's veto, ladies and gentlemen, is a stand on the wrong side of justice and accountability, a stand on the wrong side of humanity. And yet, I'm encouraged to see that today, so many more choose to stand on the right side of history. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since we joined the Council in January 2013, and on numerous occasions, Argentina supported the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, so the court could impartially exercise its jurisdiction over all parties to one of the most cruel, atrocious, and overwhelming realities of our time. Allowing the perpetration of impunity to be the response to the crimes that all parties are committing in Syria not only corrodes the ethical, political, and legal foundations of the United Nations, but also this Council's responsibility to maintain international peace and security. It is untenable and even offensive today to try to repeat the false dichotomy between peace and justice. We have all learned that there is no justice without peace, and that peace is endangered without justice. Thus, following our political resolve, our ethical responsibility, and our commitment to international law, Argentina voted for the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, with the sole, firm, and clear objective of the court investigating and prosecuting the perpetrators of crimes under the Rome Statute, and the recognition of the inalienable right of victims to truth, memory, justice, and reparation. But at the same time, Argentina decided not to co-sponsor this initiative because it also was our objective to preserve the integrity of the statute, and this requires that this Council's referrals be formulated in the appropriate terms so as not to undermine the legal foundations of the Rome Statute or the court's validity and effectiveness. Mr. President, on the one hand, it seems that over and over again, the purpose is to make us accept the exercise of selectivity when it comes to justice. We should not be surprised that when faced with comparable situations when heinous crimes are committed, some are considered appropriate for referral to the court, while others are not. On the other hand, there also seems to be an attempt to make us believe that undermining the integrity of legal instruments does not hinder the objective of achieving justice. Sometimes, in some cases, there is a use of very sophisticated arguments, although they mainly apply the pragmatic principle that the end justifies the means. But we've learned from experience that not every means leads to the end sought. For Argentina and for many member states, normal use of arbitrariness, legal regression, and practicality without values are not valid options. In our view, every heinous crime must be brought to justice wherever it is committed, whoever committed it. Just as with human rights, it is impossible to say that we uphold some but not others. We cannot say that we defend the applicability of some provisions of a norm but not its entirety. Mr. President, in 2005, when the Council adopted Resolution 1593 referring the situation in Darfur to the ICC, when Argentina was one of the elected members, we maintained that some elements of the resolution should not become permanent. However, today we face the same scenario, as the text of the draft firstly reflects the intention that the referral dealt with today covers some subjects but not others. B, it admits exemptions from the material scope of the court's jurisdiction and from the obligation to cooperate with the court. And C, it includes a provision indicating that the Council recognizes that the expenses arising from the referral will not be defrayed by the United Nations but by states parties to the Rome Statute or voluntary contributions, which is in contravention of the provisions of the Rome Statute. Do we need to remind the Security Council that it has the power to compel all members of the United Nations, both parties and non-parties to the Rome Statute, to cooperate with the court? It is disappointing that the Council does not put that ethical obligation into practice. When it comes to exemptions to the jurisdiction for national of non-party states to the statute and non-financing of United Nations referrals, I must express not only Argentina's firm objection to this kind of provision, but also our understanding of how this operates, including in the two previous referrals. According to the Rome Statute, the court in a referral exercises its jurisdiction over nationals of parties and non-parties to the Rome Statute. No pronouncement or statement of the Security Council has the power to amend the statute so as to grant immunity to nationals of non-party states committing crimes under the statute in a situation referred to the court. In other words, nothing in the text of paragraph 7 or of any other paragraph of the draft just voted would have had the power to alter the norms of the statute with regard to either the jurisdiction of the court in the situation or the fact that if a decision is needed, the court ultimately is the judge of its own jurisdiction. When it comes to the financing of the referrals, a provision included in paragraph 8 is not in accordance with the Rome Statute and the relationship agreement between the United Nations and the court, and it is blatantly unfair. Argentina disagrees with the approach of the Council attempting to indicate that the expenses of the referral will not be defrayed by the United Nations. The Council cannot arrogate to itself a power it does not have, such as that of deciding on the financing of the referral. According to the Charter, that is in the jurisdiction of the General Assembly. This is clear even in the text of paragraph 8, which refers to General Assembly Resolution 67-295. The General Assembly, following the relationship agreement with the Court, decides in a timely manner on the financing of referrals made by the Council. Mr. President, I would like to conclude by expressing that this is a very delicate and painful session. What we should have done in good faith and failed to do, to speak with one voice, was finally done by helplessness. Countless victims have heard the Council was unable to reach agreement for stopping and annihilating violence and also to get rid of humiliating impunity and thus to recover Syria's lost peace. But the noble mission and the role of the International Criminal Court in a multilateral system that aims to end impunity, establish the rule of law, promote and encourage respect for human rights, and achieve sustainable peace in accordance with international law and the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, as recalled in the Kampala Declaration, does not allow us to suppose that we will never achieve just what we wish to achieve just because we have not been able to achieve it until now. There is too much injustice for us not to be fully confident that this Security Council, sooner rather than later, will change both its idea of power and its ways of acting. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Argentina for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Chad.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. For more than 3 years, the situation in Syria has worsened daily. There's no sign of improvement or calm on the horizon. Essentially, each day brings its burden of victims. The Syrian civilians, in particular women, children, and the elderly, are between a rock and a hard place. They continue to be the target of deliberate attacks, daily experiencing airstrikes, artillery strikes, barrel bombs, forced displacements, car bombings, rape, torture, abductions, and kidnappings. All of these things are serious violations of international law and international humanitarian law. Their perpetrators, from whatever side they may be, must be held to account. Chad has always condemned and shall continue to condemn violence and all atrocities perpetrated against civilians from wherever they may emanate. Unfortunately, we note with regret that all of these atrocities have not only gone unpunished, but have become more numerous as the conflict has escalated. The scope of violence and a lack of prospects for a peaceful settlement to the crisis, we think, jeopardize conditions conducive to a fair and credible prosecution of crimes in the national justice system. In this regard, not supporting an initiative to combat impunity and the lack of justice would be a serious lack of responsibility from my country, Chad, under the Rome Statute. Backed by its belief and wanting to make a contribution to collective efforts to put an end to the suffering of victims, Chad voted in favor of the draft resolution, which was just put to a vote but not adopted, unfortunately. Mr. President, while voting in principle for, Chad regrets that for the same crimes, this draft resolution, such as the ones on Darfur or Libya, does leave a discretionary treatment for those coming from the state. This discretion, which is justified in certain ways, would never be acceptable for victims, however, and does undermine the principle of account settling or the settling of scores and the ideal of an independent and credible international judiciary, where all, without exception, are held to account for the most grave crimes. In conclusion, Chad would reiterate its appeal to all parties to the Syrian conflict to swiftly uphold their obligation to protect civilians, humanitarian staff, transport vehicles, those as well as health vehicles, to allow these individuals to reach civilians without obstacle. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Chad for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We understand the motives of many delegations who supported or co-sponsored today's draft resolution referring the Syrian file to the ICC. We share their emotions caused by the crisis in Syria, which has been dragging on for far too long. It is hard to see the destruction, loss of life, and suffering of people. It is more difficult to figure out the motives of France, which initiated the draft and put it to a vote, fully aware in advance of the fate it would meet. There is no dearth of complaints about the lack of unity on the Security Council among the P5 on Syria. Indeed, when that unity is present, we manage to achieve concrete positive results. Among them, undoubtedly, is the Security Council Resolution 2118 on the destruction of the Syrian chemical stockpile. That program is about to be successfully completed. Another important benchmark was the Security Council Resolution 2139 on humanitarian issues. P5 unity is important. After all, it is the reason for which France has been pushing for the P5's engagement in the political settlement of the crisis, having failed, however, to advance any positive substantive ideas. Then why deal such a blow to the P5 unity at this stage? Is it just to try once again to create a pretext for armed intervention in the Syrian conflict? One could not overlook that the head of the French diplomacy saw it fit to take advantage of his recent visit to Washington to publicly criticize the United States for refusing to shower missiles and bombs on Syria last fall. It should be pointed out that this damage to the P5 unity is inflicted at a critical point in the efforts to find a political solution to the Syrian crisis. An involuntary hiatus created by the resignation of Dr. Brahimi should be used for an in-depth, fair, and collective analysis of the situation, for seeking out any possible reserves to break the vicious circle of violence. Here, there is food for thought contained in the political testament left behind by Dr. Brahimi to the Security Council on May 13th. This is exactly what the draft Security Council resolution tabled by Russia aims at, to foster the process of local truces. The draft is not to the liking of our Western colleagues. They claim that settlements already achieved cannot be used as standards. One cannot but recall a Russian saying, "A bad peace is better than a good quarrel." And what are our Western colleagues proposing instead? Talk, good for naive people, that they will be supplying new types of weapons to good opposition groups only. Their list of good guys now includes the Islamic Front, which has openly confessed to a series of brutal terrorist attacks, including a recent one in Aleppo that claimed the lives of dozens of civilians. I would note that our Western colleagues are demanding that cross-border humanitarian deliveries to Syria be conducted through border crossings controlled by the Islamic Front. At the same time, they have long blocked any condemnation by the Security Council of numerous terrorist attacks committed in Syria. Pursuing the regime change by force in Syria at all costs precipitated the drawing out of the crisis and undermines the Geneva negotiations. It is telling that Ahmed Jarba, leader of the National Coalition, did not make an effort to show up to the Geneva negotiations and instead travels the world in search of weapons. And Ahmad al-Khatib, his predecessor, was removed from office just for attempting to launch talks with Damascus to stop bloodshed. In this context, it is striking that there is not a single word on the political settlement and the negotiations process among Syrians in the communiqué issued on May 15th following the meeting of the so-called London 11. And the Western Troika took great pains to dissuade the Secretary General and his special envoy from calling another round of Geneva negotiations. What justice can one talk about when the overriding policy aims at escalating the conflict? The draft resolution rejected today reveals an attempt to use the ICC to further inflame political passions and lay the groundwork, in the end, for eventual outside military intervention. It should be noted that the so-called Caesar report used to build up tension upstream of the introduction of the draft was based on unconfirmed information obtained from unverifiable sources and therefore cannot serve as a platform for taking such a serious decision. One cannot ignore the fact that the last time the Security Council referred a case to the ICC, that is the Libyan file through Resolution 1970, it didn't help resolve the crisis, but instead added fuel to the flames of conflict. And after the cessation of hostilities, the ICC, to put it mildly, did not rise to the occasion. The ICC does not contribute to a return of normalcy or justice to Libya by evading the most pressing issues. The death of civilians as a result of NATO bombardments was somehow left outside of its scope. Our colleagues from NATO countries arrogantly refused to address this issue altogether. They even refused to apologize. And they wax eloquent about shame. They advocate fighting impunity, but are themselves practicing a policy of all permissiveness. The United States frequently shows the path to the ICC to others, but is reluctant to accede to the Rome Statute itself. And in today's draft, the United States insisted on an exemption for itself and its citizens. Great Britain is a party to the ICC, but for some reason is unenthusiastic about the exploration in the court of crimes committed by the British nationals during the Iraq War. If the United States and the United Kingdom together were to refer their Iraqi file to the ICC, the world would see that they are truly against impunity. Mr. President, we proceed from the premise that the Geneva Communiqué of June 30, 2012 remains at the core of efforts to settle the Syrian crisis. The Communiqué interprets the principles of accountability and national reconciliation as interrelated, leaving the leading role in this process to Syrians themselves. We are convinced that justice in Syria will eventually prevail. Those guilty of perpetrating grave crimes will be punished. But in order for this to happen, peace is first needed, first and foremost. Russia will continue to exert every effort to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible. We call upon our Western colleagues to abandon their futile, dead-end policy of endlessly escalating the Syrian crisis. We invite everyone who truly value the interests of the Syrian people to join us in the efforts aimed at a Syrian political settlement. Making judgments, as done today by France, that the political process is dead, is just irresponsible. This is indeed a treachery in the face of the Syrian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. Now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for more than 3 years, the escalation in the conflict in Syria has incurred deep sufferings on the people in Syria and has also posed a serious challenge to the countries in the region and the international community. China has always maintained that all parties in Syria should respect human rights, respect international humanitarian law, and prevent harming innocent people during the conflict. China is firmly opposed to all acts of violation of international humanitarian law or serious violations of human rights committed by all parties to the conflict in Syria. However, with regard to the draft resolution just voted on by the Council just now, China has some serious difficulties. First, China believes that any action to seek recourse to ICC for prosecuting perpetrators of serious violations should be conducted based on the premise of respecting state judicial sovereignty and respecting the principle of complementarity. China is not a state party to the Roman Statute. China always holds reservation with regard to the Security Council referring to the situation of a country to ICC. This is our principled position. Secondly, at present, efforts to seek political settlement to the question of Syria has encountered difficulties. The international community must firm up its confidence, maintain patience, and be steadfastly committed to the overall direction of a political settlement. What is most urgently needed now is to urge the government of Syria and the opposition to immediately cease fire and violence, to start a third round of negotiation in Geneva, to push forward political process, and to start a political transition. Under current circumstances, to forcibly refer the situation of Syria to ICC is neither conducive to building trust among all parties in Syria or to the early resumption of the negotiation in Geneva. It will only jeopardize the efforts made by the international community to push for the political settlement. Thirdly, for some time now, the Security Council has maintained unity and coordination on the question of Syria. This is because members of the Council, including China, have made efforts to try to accommodate the major concerns of each side. We believe that at the time when there is serious divergence of views concerning the draft resolution among all sides, the Security Council should continue to hold consultations rather than forcibly push for the vote on the draft resolution, so as not to undermine the unity of the Council or obstruct the coordination and cooperation in the Council in dealing with questions such as Syria and other major serious issues. Regrettably, China's above-mentioned principle has not been taken on board. Based on this, China voted against the draft resolution. As to why China voted against the draft resolution, I've already clearly elaborated on my country's position. I have brought out the facts and the reason very explicitly. Just now, United States, UK, and other Western countries made totally unfounded accusations against China. And this is this is not responsible, and it's hypocrite. China categorically rejects those insults rendered by those Western countries on China. Mr. President, China has always upheld an objective and impartial position on the question of Syria. China does not pursue any self-interest on this issue, much less shield any party, factions, or person in Syria. As a permanent member of the Security Council and a responsible member of the international community, China has always been committed to seeking political settlement to the question of Syria. China has worked in a comprehensive and balanced manner to engage with the government of Syria and the opposition parties, to urge them on the basis of the demands of all sides to try to seek a middle path that would suit the national conditions and accommodate the interests of all sides. China is is highly concerned about the humanitarian situation in Syria and sympathizes with the suffering and experienced by the Syrian people, and have provided humanitarian assistance to Syrian people and its refugees in neighboring countries through various channels on many occasions. China highly attaches great importance to the legitimate concerns of all sides and Arab countries on the question of Syria, and we are really to maintain close contact with all parties and make active efforts to seek appropriate solution to the question of Syria and to maintain peace and stability in the Middle East region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea voted in favor of the draft resolution. The situation in Syria requires resolute and swift action by the Security Council. Seeking accountability should be part of this action because sustainable peace is not possible without justice. This is why we voted in favor of the draft resolution, which was to refer the Syrian criminals against humanity to the International Criminal Court. It is extremely regrettable that the Council was not able to agree to take action due to the vetoes. We are letting down the aspiration of the international community and the Syrian people. It is also disappointing to see the misplaced perception that efforts to deliver justice cannot be compatible with efforts to seek a political solution. Having said that, I still believe that the Council cannot afford to take today's vote as a lasting setback in our efforts. The current situation on the ground is simply too serious and continues to call for effective action by the Council. The Republic of Korea remains committed to working with other members to answer the call. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of France has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I hoped that the tone of my speech would demonstrate to everybody around this table and in this chamber our will to avoid the Council from displaying the same divisions again. I wanted my speech to show my will to respect the dignity of this debate, since it is one that is about the infinite suffering of the Syrian people and the will that those who committed crimes be held to account one day for those crimes. And I see no other way except an appeal to the International Criminal Court. So it was a very simple statement, and I deplore the fact that the representative of the Russian Federation replied with invective and personal attacks, direct personal attacks. I will return to 4 points raised by my Russian colleague: absurdity, error, and barefacedness. Absurdity, saying that we presented this resolution to prepare a military intervention. I don't think it is even worth arguing. As Talleyrand said, the excessive is insignificant. We've seen our Russian colleague fly from Tripoli to Baghdad as if the excesses committed in Tripoli and Baghdad excuse those crimes and excesses being committed in Damascus. Error when my Russian colleague says that the Syrian National Coalition is responsible for the impasse of the talks in Geneva, when Mr. Brahimi himself said to the Council that in reality it is the regime which refuses the two-pronged approach he suggested, parallel negotiation on terrorism and transition government. The representative of the Russian Federation called on Mr. Brahimi several times to convene new negotiations in Geneva, and Mr. Brahimi answered that it was impossible because the regime simply did not want to negotiate the transition, beginning by saying that we should begin with a general agreement on terrorism and then go on to the transition. The description that my Russian colleague made of the reasons for the failure of the Geneva negotiations is erroneous. And then the barefacedness, I believe that it's called chutzpah in New York. The West is accused of providing weapons to the opposition when Russia has never stopped providing weapons to the regime. I'm absolutely speechless at the fact that the Russian Federation dares to raise this issue of weapons. But if you wish, Mr. Ambassador of the Russian Federation, we can impose an arms embargo on Syria. I would be happy to vote for it, but I don't think that you would. The Caesar report saying that it is not verifiable, well, I'm very sorry about that. It's simply not true. The Caesar report was submitted to independent experts from several countries, and all these independent experts said that the photographs technically could not have been altered. I'm very sorry to have to answer in this tone on the attacks that were made on the French ministry, myself, and France. I wanted this debate to bear only on the atrocities committed by both parties. We said so in Syria. And our simple will to say that in 2014, as I said, we have to send a very clear message. We cannot allow what happened in 1942 and 1994 to happen again. There are judges, there are courts, and there are criminals who could be brought to justice, but it seems that there is a preference to protecting them. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Permit me at the outset to extend, in the name of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, our condolences to the government and people of Nigeria, given the terrorist acts that battered Kano and Tus cities and took the toll of hundreds of innocent civilians. We sympathize with the relatives of the victims. I would like to start my statement with this condolence because all of us around this round table feel the enormity of terrorism. None of you feels that as we, the Syrians, feel it. Mr. President, some member states introducing this draft resolution while dealing with the Syrian situation remind me of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the novel of the Scottish writer Robert Stevenson. Those states are trying to impersonate the role of Dr. Jekyll, the good guy, by promoting noble principles, while in reality they represent Mr. Hyde, the evil guy. This evil role is manifested through their involvement in backing terrorism in Syria and contributing to the continuation of Syrian bloodshed and shedding crocodile tears over bloodshed in Syria. The hands of Mr. Hyde, ladies and gentlemen, are stained with Syrian blood, although he falsely claims his friendship for the Syrian people. So much so that even the former president of the so-called Syrian coalition, mentioned by my colleague, the permanent representative of Russian Federation, I say the former president of so-called Syrian coalition, a coalition pre-orchestrated and manufactured by those who call themselves friends of the Syrian people, described himself a few days ago. Those friends, and I quote, half of them are liars, imposters, and hypocrites, and they are responsible for the conditions we are witnessing today in Syria, adding that the West seeks to partition Syria, end of quote. This is the statement of a former president of the Doha coalition that was manufactured in well-known capitals. It is a mere coincidence that history presents lots of evidence authenticating this fact. On this day in 1945, the Syrian delegation was participating in the San Francisco Conference for the efforts of drafting the Charter of the United Nations, during which a formulation of Article 78 of the UN Charter was reached, and it guaranteed that Syria would not become a territory under French mandate. Dear colleagues, the occupying French authorities on the day of May 29, 1945, bombed the Syrian parliament and killed its garrison. Thus, since war crimes are not subject to the statute of limitation, as we heard, we demand that the Security Council hold the French government accountable for the crimes that were committed against the Syrians and the peoples of many countries it had previously occupied and looted their resources. We call upon the French government to apologize in public and to pay compensation to our people. We wish to assure that the Syrian people will not forget the Sykes-Picot Agreement and also the subsequent dislodging of the Syrian Iskandron region by France and handing it to Turkey. In addition, the people of our region will never turn a blind eye to the fact that France is the one who introduced Israeli nuclear terrorism to the region. Mr. President, the structure of international legal system is based on fundamental pillars, most important of which is the fact that states hold the primary responsibility and exclusive responsibility for accountability and establishing justice on their territory. As a result of the regrettable events affecting my country, the Syrian government has taken a series of measures designed to hold accountable those involved in the events and to take legal action against them accordingly. The National Investigation Committee continues to do its job in parallel with the Syrian judiciary, which is looking into thousands of cases since the start of the crisis, 30,000 cases, and has issued rulings for those involved and has settled the conditions of others. This confirms the desire and ability of the Syrian government to achieve justice and negates any pretext to involve any international judicial body that clashes with our national judiciary powers. The Syrian crisis has unveiled the level of hegemony of double standards on the mechanisms of the United Nations and using them to target certain member states in specific regions in the world in the name of law and justice. As a continuation of this approach, a group of member states submitted the draft resolution before us today. A draft that is apolitical, discriminatory, and interventionist par excellence. This draft aims at disturbing the presidential elections in Syria and reshuffling the cards, fueling the crisis, and achieving the goals of a propaganda show. This draft seeks to involve the Security Council in the hysteria of hostility adopted by some member states towards Syria and its people. Tabling this draft resolution represents a ceaseless attempt by some states to arrogate to themselves the right to be custodians of the Syrian people and its national choices. This attempt constitutes an open disregard for the will of the Syrian people and starkly contradicts the recurrent confirmation of the Security Council of its strong commitment to the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic, its independence, unity, and territorial integrity, and to the call for a Syrian-led political solution for the Syrian crisis. Moreover, the grounds presented by the sponsors to justify the request of referral to the ICC are nothing but mendacious allegations and fabricated lies contained in politicized and biased reports that absolutely defy reason. Those reports are provided by committees that ignored all the complaints, documents, evidence, and proofs provided by the Syrian government. Those reports effectively contribute to serving the agendas of states engaged in hostile campaign against my country, Syria. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic believes in international criminal justice and was among the active states during the Rome Conference, which adopted the International Criminal Court Statute. Syria was among its initial signatories. The Syrian perspective stems from the need for justice to be inclusive and transparent, far from being politicized, selective, and subject to double standards. Against this background, Syria called for the inclusion of the crime of aggression in the court's jurisdiction as the mother of all crimes. However, that was turned down. Therefore, my country has not ratified the Rome Statute. Today, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic emphasizes that the achievement of justice requires the following. First, holding accountable the governments of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, France, Israel, and other states that are inciting openly violence and terrorism, including those through funding, arming, sponsoring, training, recruiting, and facilitating the crossing of thousands of mercenaries and terrorists coming from the different parts of the world to Syria, and not only turning a blind eye to their crimes and also describing them as moderate opposition. I would like to convey to you a piece of news mentioned by the Commander-in-Chief of the air weapon of Libya. He said that the terrorist Qaeda organization in Libya and the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya together, they sent 224 air flights from Libya to Turkey and from there to Syria to transfer the terrorist mercenaries to Syria. Mr. President, the balance of international justice and the rule of law will not be set right without putting an end to the practices of those states and their violations of international law and Security Council resolutions related to combating international terrorism. Terrorism is a crime, regardless of who perpetrates it, where or why it is committed. Since the terrorism practiced by Boko Haram in Nigeria is unanimously condemned, it must be countered by equal condemnation to their counterparts sponsored by Israel in the separation area in the occupied Syrian Golan and who are backed and recruited by Turkey in the north, and who are armed by Western and Arab governments in full view of the United Nations. Those terrorists have committed unspeakable crimes that shame human conscience, most recently cutting the water supply to the city of Aleppo and depriving about 3 million Syrians of drinking water and sanitation. We would have wished to see the state submitting this draft resolution tabling instead a draft resolution to combat terrorism suffered by the Syrians. Second, accountability for documented war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of aggression and occupation perpetrated by Israeli occupation authorities in the occupied Arab territories, including the occupied Syrian Golan for over 7 decades, is absent. Those crimes have been committed with the support of some permanent members in this esteemed council who so far have enabled the Israeli war criminals to escape punishment and obstructed all initiatives to hold them accountable. Third, refraining from the attempts undermining justice through immunities some of the great powers made exclusive for themselves. This has assisted those powers in escaping any accountability for human rights violations and the crimes committed by them in other member states of this organization in order to implement colonial agendas and schemes of domination and oppression. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, inundating Libya with blood, secret prisons, using drones to kill innocent civilians, the practices of mercenary companies such as Blackwater in Iraq and others are vivid examples of double standards and escaping accountability and punishment. It is ironic that these countries continue their attempts to impose their national legislation beyond their borders and recently imposed sanctions on the head of the National Relief Committee in Syria while paying lip service to their alleged support for the Syrian people. Imagine that sanctions have been imposed on the head of the National Relief Committee, humanitarian relief in Syria. Valerie Amos knows the head of the National Relief Committee in Syria, and I will refer these sanctions to her. Hopefully she will do something. Those lots of evidence, among others, highlight that justice is tailored to fit the measurements of targeted states. A crime may be prefabricated for some states in order to refer them to the state, while others are shielded by a curtain that blocks the view of their documented crimes and violations. This draft resolution has been formulated in a way that protects holding accountable Israeli war criminals for their crimes against the Syrian people. Its draft keeps foreign terrorists and mercenaries coming from other countries independent from the court's jurisdiction. This process undermines the credibility of its drafter and exposes their malicious intents and aggressive motives. Once again, as we are talking about, the sanctions imposed on the head of the National Relief Committee, I would like to remind you of another scandal that took place when sanctions were imposed on the Minister of Electricity in Syria. We referred the matter of the head of the National Relief Committee in Syria to Valerie Amos, and we will refer the sanctions on the Minister of Electricity to the court of Tommy Edison. Once again, my delegation assures that all member states who claim their concern for Syria and its people that the way to help the Syrian people is clear and well known, and it is by exerting sincere and serious efforts to fight terrorism which targets Syria and its people. It is also through supporting the efforts aiming at finding a national solution to the Syrian crisis. The solution should take into consideration Geneva process, which is based on dialogue among Syrians themselves in order to reach consensus on rejecting violence, combating terrorism, and establishing a national unity government away from attempts to impose guardianship and interventionist agendas that do not mean any good for Syria nor its people. Syrians who will go to the polls to elect the President of the Republic are doing so to protect their country from terrorism, creative chaos, and the attempts to undermine the concepts of the state and sovereignty altogether. In concluding, Mr. President, seems that the current French government has understood erroneously the famous phrase in French literature that say hell is the others, l'enfer c'est les autres, in terms of the belief that others are always an embodiment of hell, while what the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre meant of this phrase in that hell might be yourself and your view of others, as well as the way you interact with them. Therefore, the French government should look at itself first, so it might see hell in its actions and behaviors and not in others. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. The representative of France has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Non, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, please excuse me. I do not want to extend the debate further or get into polemics. I simply want to make a factual correction on the text we voted on. Unlike what our Syrian colleague has just said, this resolution does not exempt foreign mercenary terrorists from other countries from the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. In OP1, it very clearly says that armed groups naturally are concerned. But it also says in OP7, when it comes to the exemption, this only covers nationals of a country which is not a party to the Rome Statute, who are engaged in operations established or authorized by the Council. In other terms, if a citizen of a member state of the Security Council were to participate in the operations on Syrian territory, the International Criminal Court could naturally prosecute them. The exemption of OP7 does not protect terrorists, no matter what their nationality may be. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russia.
I just have to note that my French colleague today doesn't sound very convincing. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia for his statement. The Security Council, I give the floor to the representative of France.
N'est convaincu que...
Only those who wish to be persuaded are persuaded.
Thank you. I give the floor to Russia.
We will not give in to what you say.
I hope they have had enough exchange of one-sentence statements. The Security Council has thus concluded the present stage of its consideration of the item on its agenda. The meeting is adjourned.